This chart tracks gold through early 2026. After peaking near $5,600 in January, the price slid 16%, touching $4,000 by June. But look who moved the market. While Western ETF investors panicked and liquidated, global central banks aggressively bought the dip. In June, China absorbed another 15 tons of physical gold, extending a massive 20-month buying streak. Meanwhile, Poland locked away 64 tons in just the first 6 months of the year, and those are just the numbers reported to the IMF. By tracking physical trade flows through refineries in London and Switzerland, the World Gold Council discovered that actual central bank purchases were 15 times higher than official reports. These institutions are building a systemic shield. They are hoarding physical bars to insulate national wealth against a financial system where overseas assets can be frozen by a single unilateral decision. The catalyst for this rush traces back to 2022, when Western powers froze the foreign exchange reserves of the Bank of Russia. That single decision proved to nations outside the G7 that traditional financial assets held overseas can be voided with the stroke of a pen. That leaves physical gold as the only top-tier asset on the planet carrying zero counterparty risk. When stored within a nation's borders, it exists entirely outside the SWIFT financial messaging network. For Beijing, this accumulation is a direct preparation for potential economic warfare. In the event of a conflict in the Taiwan Strait, the G7 would likely deploy immediate, comprehensive financial sanctions against China. China's current stockpile of over 2,300 tons of gold isn't large enough to fully replace the dollar in their $18 trillion economy. But in the early days of an embargo, that physical reserve acts as an unfreezable lifeline to secure critical emergency shipments of energy and food. They are also actively blocking external market contagion. In June of 2026, the Chinese government forced domestic retail margin requirements up to 140%. They intentionally crushed local speculative leverage to protect national reserves from the volatility of Wall Street's AI stock bubble. Sovereign powers are deliberately decoupling their wealth from two specific threats: geopolitical retaliation from the West and the structural fragility of paper asset bubbles. When macroeconomic planners build these defenses, they don't operate on raw tonnage. They use strict mathematical ratios to balance liquidity with national security. The International Monetary Fund uses the Assessing Reserve Adequacy metric, which states that a nation's reserves need to cover 100 to 150% of the potential capital flight and sudden trade shocks a country might face. Then there is the Greenspan-Guidati rule, an economic standard dictating that a country's foreign reserves must fully cover all of its external debt maturing within the next 12 months. Optimal gold allocation for national defense is strictly 3 to 5% of total GDP. Developed nations like the US and Germany hold over 80% of reserves in gold, while emerging markets buy to hit a 15 to 30% safety threshold. Achieving these mathematical ratios lowers a nation's sovereign risk premium. In practice, that helps reduce their international borrowing costs by up to 70 basis points. For the private investor, persistent structural inflation and highly unpredictable real yields have shattered the reliability of the traditional 60-40 stock and bond portfolio. Navigating this environment requires abandoning the instinct to trade gold for short-term capital gains. Instead, you need to architect your personal balance sheet exactly like a sovereign central bank. The mandate is straightforward. Allocate exactly 10 to 15% of your total wealth into physical gold or highly reputable physically backed ETFs, treating it exclusively as structural portfolio insurance. Do not use margin or leverage on this allocation. This portion of your wealth is engineered strictly for extreme risk defense, not for generating yield. Looking ahead over the next 6 to 12 months, regardless of whether the broader markets push higher or slide into a bear phase, the strategy remains defensive. Mimic the central banks and steadily deploy capital into gold during any major price correction. Because when a systemic storm eventually arrives, fiat debt and paper assets can evaporate. Tangible physical sovereignty is what endures.